Here's the subject that Fuchs used in several of the demonstration fugues that I've shown in previous videos. And here is the countersubject Fuchs composed that was meant to work alla decima, meaning at the 10th. This countersubject is invertible at the 10th, meaning that if we transpose the countersubject a 10th below, it will still form correct counterpoint with the subject. This is an immensely useful trick in composing a fugue, but it is actually somewhat rare compared to invertible counterpoint at the octave, or even at the 12th. Here is a chart that I used back in the video on how to compose invertible counterpoint that shows how the harmonic intervals invert at the 10th. The perfect consonances are shown in blue, imperfect consonances are shown in green, and dissonances are red. We can see that the first interval of Fuchs's countersubject is a third above, which inverts to an octave below. The fifth becomes a sixth, the sixth becomes a fifth, and the octave becomes a third. Here's what the inverted countersubject sounds like. The chart tells us that all imperfect consonances will invert into perfect consonances, and vice versa, which means that when composing invertible counterpoint at the 10th, we need to treat all our imperfect consonances as if they are perfect. That means every consonance must be approached in either contrary or oblique motion. We can tell that Fuchs's countersubject will work in invertible counterpoint at the 10th at a glance, by the way, because the whole thing simply moves stepwise in contrary motion to the subject. This will always work because the consonances will be approached by contrary motion, and whatever dissonances there might be will always behave as passing tones. Speaking of dissonances, though, we do have to consider suspension dissonances separately. A 9-8 suspension will invert into a perfectly correct 2-3 suspension. A 7-6 suspension will also invert into a correct 4-5 bass suspension. However, the very common 4-3 suspension will invert into a 7-8 bass suspension, which you'll recall is considered weak in strict counterpoint. So, for that reason, we should also avoid the 4-3 suspension when composing invertible counterpoint at the 10th. I should mention one last neat thing about Fuchs's fugue subject and countersubject before showing you the fugue he composed using them. That is that the countersubject is also invertible at the octave, and this is a common and useful feature of these kinds of countersubjects. If you recall from the video on countersubjects invertible at the octave, the perfect fifth is usually the tricky interval because it inverts into a dissonant fourth upon inversion, and so one might think at first glance that this countersubject shouldn't work inverted at an octave. But when it occurs in an inner voice, for instance doubled in parallel thirds, with the version that was inverted at the lower 10th, like this, then the interval of a fourth is formed between upper parts rather than with the bass, and so it is perfectly strict three-part writing. Themes being doubled in thirds, sixths, or tenths like this is usually a dead giveaway that we are dealing with invertible counterpoint at the 10th. Now, here is the fugue that Fuchs composed using these materials. The exposition unfolds in ascending order. The bass takes the subject in measure 1. The tenor takes the answer in measure 4, while the bass continues with the countersubject below. The alto takes the subject in measure 7, while the lower voices take the countersubject doubled in thirds. Then, finally, the soprano takes the answer in measure 11, while the alto and tenor take the countersubject doubled in thirds, and the bass drops out of the texture. Because this exposition introduces the voices from bottom to top, there was no opportunity to show that the countersubject also works inverted above the fugue subject. So Fuchs immediately continues into a counter exposition. The bass enters with the answer in measure 15, and the soprano and tenor state the countersubject doubled this time in sixths above the bass. Fuchs is doing something actually kind of weird here in the tenor that he does not explain or even bring up in the text of Gradus. The tenor is inverted not at a 10th, but at a 12th, which is where we get this dissonant 7th on the downbeat of measure 17. This 7th behaves as an accented passing tone, which is not a proper dissonance in strict counterpoint, such as Fuchs would have taught in earlier chapters of his book. But now that the student has reached fugue and free composition, Fuchs is more willing to show exceptions to the rule. The bass and alto then take the countersubject doubled in tenths, and we get this strange thematic statement in the soprano. The student character, Joseph, asks his teacher about this, since voices aren't supposed to be able to enter the texture with material other than the fugue subject, answer, or countersubject. Alois, the teacher, explains that this is actually a melodic inversion of the countersubject. It is not immediately recognizable, since the countersubject ascended stepwise through the interval of a fourth, and the inversion begins with a leap of a third, so that it now outlines a diminished fifth. I suppose Fuchs was thinking along the same lines of fugal subjects and answers, where outlines of a fourth would commonly be answered by a fifth. This leads into the first strong cadence of the fugue in the key of A minor. Let's listen to the first half of this fugue. The next section begins with a tenor statement of the answer, while the bass takes the countersubject a tenth below. This happens to also work while the alto takes the subject in stretto. The soprano and tenor accompany this statement with the countersubject doubled in parallel tenths. As we work towards the next cadence, Fuchs gives the bass voice the inverted form of the countersubject again, also outlining a descending diminished fifth, just to let us know that the first time wasn't a mistake. After all, repetition legitimizes. The tenor has a statement of the countersubject in diminution, in quarter notes rather than half notes, and the alto takes the dissonant form of the countersubject that places an accented passing tone yet again on the downbeat. All of this sets up the second cadence of the piece in the key of F major. The final section begins with the soprano and alto in stretto, while the tenor takes the countersubject below them. Then another statement, this time doubled in tenths with the soprano. The bass then finally re-enters the texture with a final statement of the subject, while the alto and soprano accompany with the countersubject doubled in sixths. This leads smoothly into the final pedal point and cadence in the tonic. For the sake of being thorough, let's listen now to the whole thing from the beginning to the end. Notice just how much Fuchs is able to recycle the same materials while at the same time avoiding literal repetition of any phrases. He uses invertible counterpoint at the 10th to get the best of both worlds. For the second half of the video, I want to show how invertible counterpoint at the 10th is used in an instrumental fugue from a slightly later period. Fuchs's fugue was a strict fugue in the sense that, even though the rendering I gave a moment ago was performed on the organ, it could easily have been a vocal fugue. All we would need to do is slap some text on the subject, like Kyrie, and on the countersubject, like eleison, and we could easily arrange the fugue for choir. This works because the subject and countersubject are not substantially altered on each appearance throughout the fugue. They are treated as proper themes, not as motives that can be rearranged and scrambled up. The same cannot be said of Mozart's fugue in C major from K394. He also premises this fugue in invertible counterpoint at the 10th, but he breaks the fugue subject up into smaller motives and recombines them in different ways. This is an inherently instrumental approach to fugue, because it would not be so easy to assign text to this subject that could be repeated verbatim in subsequent statements. The first motive is this descending third, which I will call motive A and label blue. Motive B is red and alternates ascending fourths and descending fifths. And motive C is green and involves these ascending and descending stepwise patterns. And here is Mozart's countersubject. It is full of appoggiaturas, which are dissonances approached by leap that one would not find in a strict counterpoint textbook, but that occur frequently in the music of the later 18th century. The countersubject is mostly made of these pairs of upper and lower appoggiaturas, which I will call motive D, since, as we will see, Mozart doesn't always bring back the entire countersubject. Sometimes he'll just bring back sequences of this motive that sound close enough to the countersubject that no one will notice that it isn't a literal restatement. Here is a closer look at the countersubject motive D in counterpoint with motive B. If we remove the decorative dissonances, we can see the underlying pattern of alternating thirds and octaves. Remember from our chart at the beginning of the video that thirds and octaves invert into one another in invertible counterpoint at the 10th. And so if we transpose motive B down a 10th to now occur below motive D, we can see that the thirds and octaves have simply been inverted into one another. Notice that it isn't the entire subject and countersubject that are invertible, but these two motives in particular. Finally, the tail of the subject, motive C, also works in invertible counterpoint at the 10th when paired in stretto with itself. It also alternates between octaves and thirds, and transposing the top voice a 10th below simply results in a rearrangement of the octaves and thirds. Rather than talking through the entire fugue, I've annotated a score that will scroll along with the recording. I don't want to point out every little thing, but mainly the moments when Mozart exploits invertible counterpoint at the 10th to create doublings in thirds, sixths, and tenths. Along with the appoggiaturas, I think these doublings create a stylistic impression of a fugue that was written in the Galant era. A composer like Palestrina would rarely have wanted to double voices in parallel motion in this way, but Mozart clearly intentionally took advantage of the thinner polyphonic texture that this technique affords. Instead of their SATB names, I'm going to label the lowest voice, voice 1, the middle voice, voice 2, and the top voice, voice 3, since none of these voices line up with the vocal ranges anyway.